Now, the G7 summit is currently underway in Apulia, Italy, with world leaders convening to tackle pressing global issues with a strong focus on the situation in Ukraine. The summit has already seen significant developments, including the signing of a bilateral security treaty between the US and Ukraine.
And joining us right now is Mr. Mark McNamee, co-founder of Ukraine Business News Network. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Yes, hello. Thanks for having me.
Can you first help us break down this bilateral deal between the United States and Ukraine? Just how significant is that going forward?
Well, it's significant insofar as it's just another sort of promise of long-term support to Ukraine, its defense structure, to training, long-term financial support, of course. But to be honest, if this occurred in and of itself, independent of other countries providing security guarantees and other measures that have been done recently, in particular, the $50 billion loan that's coming to Ukraine, it would be seen as entirely inadequate, at least from Kyiv's point of view, right? Kyiv naturally is desperate to get into NATO, to have the protection of the NATO defense nuclear umbrella and all these protections. But short of that, of course, Kyiv will take what they can get. So U.S. security guarantees, that follows on U.K. security guarantees. I believe another 13 other nations have given security guarantees to this degree. So it is important. This is not going to change the trajectory of the war in the near future by any means, but it sends a clear signal to the Kremlin. It's comforting, of course, to Ukrainians to have this continued support. And more broadly, it's one of numerous policies that we've seen over the last two and a half years now that were entirely really inconceivable prior to the full-scale invasion of February 2022. To see this level of commitment and determination from Western countries towards Ukraine and against Russia, with all, of course, of the potential escalatory issues facing a nuclear-armed Russia, and still the West keeps sort of pushing, crossing these various red lines. So it is very important in that respect.
And if we could deepen on the subject of the bilateral treaty itself, now, what are the key components of this bilateral security treaty signed between the US and Ukraine, practically speaking?
Yes, Sure. So more specifically, greater intelligence sharing, which has been going on at a very high level since the full-scale invasion. So much more integration of security services, and not just with the United States, with UK and other members of Western Europe. Training of troops. So this adds on to, if you recall, President Macron offering to send in military advisors to train Ukrainians on the ground here in Ukraine. That's an important one, because if we see not just French, but other NATO members, the United States, servicemen coming more officially to Ukraine in the thousands to help train Ukrainians, that's an important step as well, because one of the biggest hurdles to mobilization here within Ukraine is the fear amongst Ukrainian men that they won't get adequate training, they won't get adequate weaponry, and they'll be sent to the front under commanders of questionable legitimacy, and their fate would be decided for them. So this is another confidence-building measure that you would see these Western advisors coming, giving much better training, much better equipment, of course, and so building confidence, because mobilization is absolutely critical right now for Ukraine to increase its manpower. And then more longer term, again, the financial support that signals to Russia that the West is in it for the long haul, and then critically the domestic defense production within Ukraine. So we've already seen Germany, UK taking steps to Poland to invest and develop Ukraine's own defense domestic production. Now the United States is involved in that as well. So if you think about it in a way, Ukraine, you can make an analogy to Israel's historic situation. Israel had to develop its own defensive capacity domestically, right? In the nation's infancy, and that helped protect it, of course, to this day. Ukraine is now sort of in its infancy in protecting itself against Russia. So these support measures coming from the West for the domestic defense industry here are absolutely vital, of course.
Right, so like you mentioned, a lot of these plans being discussed are very long-term and of course shows the dedication of G7 countries to be there for Ukraine in the long haul. However, there's been a lot of criticism when it comes to these G7 leaders that's currently signing these deals. A lot of them have just been defeated in the European Parliament elections, or some others seeing a dwindling in poll numbers. Do you think if in a case of any regime change within these countries, these kind of long-term plans will be able to hold?
Sure, it's of course a very good question, because this is the other aspect of the G7 right now that shows not the strength, as we've just been discussing, but the weakness of nearly every member of the G7 that's currently in Italy is under pressure, to say the least. In some cases, very, very unlikely, in the case of Sunak in the UK, to continue in his position. So that said, if you think about, I'll hold aside the United States for a second, but UK, their determination, their support is likely to continue. You could say same thing for France, for Germany, sorry. France, a little bit more questionable, but it looks like Macron maybe made the right political move here. Japan, continued support, medium, long term. The biggest question, though, comes out of the United States, naturally. That said, what we've seen in the last 2 months from the far right in the United States, and specifically from Trump's influence on the far right, has been much more supportive of Ukraine than initially expected. We did see in April, thanks to Trump's influence and the far right, their willingness to continue to support Ukraine. And a lot of the rhetoric, the anti-Ukraine rhetoric coming from the far right in the United States, has died down a bit since April. So that's actually somewhat encouraging. And Trump himself has made actually some relatively pro-Ukrainian comments over the last few years, to be honest, but over the last 2 months as well. So it's a concern. Obviously, if Biden were to win the election, we can continue to expect further support for Ukraine. If Trump were to win, we tend to think that it's still likely that we would see continued support for Ukraine. And to be perfectly honest, we may even see a return to a much more hawkish foreign policy towards Russia, something akin to what we experienced during the Cold War, under a Trump presidency, potentially based on some of the statements he's made, based critically upon some of the statements that Speaker Johnson and the far right have made in the United States, and then, of course, the rest of the mainstream Republican Party, which have a historic, continued, strong posture, foreign policy posture towards Russia, as well as the Democrats as well. So it'll be a major gamble. But what we've seen over the last few months is actually more encouraging for continued support under either a Biden or a Trump presidency. But this is, of course, what to watch out for.
So navigating these turbulent waters of now the difficulty of political landscape that now at least Europe is facing now with European parliamentary elections and the aftermath of it. Looking ahead, to your mind, what future initiatives might the G7 consider to further support Ukraine?
As far as the G7, the first things that would come to mind as far as what's in their control to actually, beyond what we've seen in so far at the summit, would be actually the full confiscation of Russia. That would be the most clear, critical step. And I tend to think that will happen over time, but the full confiscation of Russia's FX reserves. So what we've seen, just to be clear, is a movement over time, right? About a year ago, this policy was barely discussed, really wasn't taken too seriously. We had tended to think, Ukraine Business News Network, that it would become inevitable, that the West would have to take some level of Russia's FX reserves in order to hand it to Ukraine. Financially, it's just not sustainable to support Ukraine long term without it. And we've seen steps moving from just taking the profits on the FX reserves, handing them to Ukraine, which would amount to $3, $4, $5 billion a year, which is peanuts, to be honest. And then it moved to, actually taking the profits and then securitizing that to then provide a $50 billion loan, which, again, a major step, very important. And that actually is much more substantive, around $50 billion provided every year going forward. We tend to think that going forward, it's going to require much more than just that. Yes, taxpayer dollars out of the West, continued state support, plus the $50 billion loan, but more realistically, to continue the war and then talk about recovery, talk about reconstruction, taking the underlying assets, right, the around $300 billion, more or less, of Russia's assets. That's what we should be looking out for example, at the next summit next year. That would be the most related specifically to Ukraine, looking at that financial measure. Outside of the G7, the next thing to be looking out for would be what Ukraine has desperately been trying to do, is get into NATO. We're extraordinarily unlikely to see that in July at the summit in Washington, D.C. But again, that becomes increasingly more likely over time. So maybe that's something to look out for next summer. Again, with G7 support and influence to maybe push for that from the core members of NATO being in the G7, sort of maybe leading the vanguard towards that. I wouldn't say that's even likely in a year, but I think that is the direction of travel that we would be moving in, and that the G7 would be talking about.
All right, last but not least, really quick, do you think that this meeting would actually, at least let Ukraine take that one more step towards NATO membership?
The current meeting here?
Yeah.
Yes. No, I do not. I think that was the purpose of these security guarantees, particularly from the United States. It sent a very strong message, but it also sent the other message to Russia that these are the security guarantees the United States and the Western world are willing to give, and very clearly, implicitly communicating to Moscow that we are not bringing Ukraine into NATO, at least at the moment, to, again, avoid escalating, crossing a red line from Moscow. So we're still at that point of worry of escalation from Western policy point of view.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, for all your input and insight, and help us understand this very delicate balance going on in the G7 meeting. Really appreciate it. Thanks again for being with us on TVP World.